Yes, for those who've not met me the first time for my not inconsiderable sins, I've found myself the leader of a political party, which was most definitely never my ambition. We didn't really want to have a political party. We just wanted a referendum. But when the DA promised us one and then broke their word, we'd always said to Stina Hazen and Zilla, if you break your word, we're going to put up a referendum party and take you on. They broke their word. We've kept ours. Here we are. So now, let's make it worth something. So this is our first event. We've got many more to come. So we're a new party. We're sort of trying to make our way, and we've got an important mission to do. And if I can just start by maybe just summing up, what do we believe as a political party? Because we're a single issue party. We're not a normal political party. And I would say this, we all know in our hearts, we wish we didn't, but we all know where this country is heading. We know what's going to happen if we keep on going down this path, and it's not a place where many of us want to be. And that's the reality. But we can have a different future. That doesn't have to be our end. That doesn't have to be the future of South Africa. And we can have a better future, and we can live in the future of our dreams. But we can only do it if we find the courage to stand up and do something about it and create the future that we want. And I'm going to turn that on its head, and I'm going to say that something else that's the opposite of that. The converse of that is the biggest future for us in the Western Cape is not the ANC, and it's not the EFF. The biggest threat to our future in the Western Cape is apathy and defeatism amongst our own people. The belief that we can't do anything, that this is just happening to us, and we are somehow helpless passengers. Well, we're not. We're not. We have to make a choice, and if we choose to change our future, we will. And I think we all have friends, and we all know people that every time we go to a braai, they have the answer to every problem in South Africa. They can tell you exactly what needs to be done, but they never lift a finger to do anything about it. And that's the difference. We've got to that point where we actually have to stand up and do something. And tonight, well, let me first of all start off by saying, so thank you very much for all of you that are here, because at the very least, I can't promise you the thing. I can tell you what we can do and I can tell you what we can achieve, but ultimately it's up to us. But you know what you've already done just by being here, and the people that came last night and the people that will come later tonight and tomorrow, you've already done more than what most people will do. You actually have already stood up. You're here and you're at least willing to try and make a difference. And that's where it starts. So thank you, and actually, give yourselves a good pat on the back. You're here, and at least this is the starting point. That's where we start to stand together and we start to stand up. And tonight I'm going to focus on 4 words. 4 words that hold our future in our hands. Hope. Number 1, hope. What is the future that we really want for ourselves? Defiance. What are we going to have to do to get that future? Belief. The belief that that future really is possible. And responsibility. The understanding that that future will not happen without each and every one of us playing our part. So I'm going to start, if I can, and I want you to just join in with me and help me with this. And I want you to do something that perhaps in South Africa we've forgotten to be able to do, and that is to dream. To stop and to think, well, what do we really want? We know what we don't want, but what do we really want? Imagine for a moment that you could write your own future. You can decide for ourselves here, what country do I want to live in? How would that country look? And in 10 years' time, what would be different about the Western Cape in 10 years' time to the Western Cape that I live in today? And I've got our list, but what are you guys hoping for? What is it that what country do we want to live in? What are the things that are important to us?
Peace, safety.
Safety, absolutely. Electricity, both on our list. Yeah. What else are we hoping for? Work for people, absolutely on our list. Yeah, the education. Economic development. We said we were at the post office, and that may be beyond hope. Yeah. And one of the fascinating things, and I'll share our list and you'll see we've got so many of the same things on there, because as a people, we know what we want. We know the future we really want. And we sat as a team at the Referendum Party and we said, well, what sort of country do we want to live in? We said we want to live in a non-racial country where what we achieve is not defined by the colour of our skin. We wanted to live in a country that was safe and relatively crime-free. We wanted to live in a country where people had jobs and don't have to beg on the streets or live in poverty. We wanted to live in a country where things worked, the hospitals, the schools, the railways. We wanted electricity and clean drinking water. We want our sick and our elderly to be properly cared for. We want to get rid of the squatter camps and informal settlements that are spreading everywhere around us. We want people to be able to live in decent houses. And we want our money to actually be worth something on the international stage. And that's the future that I think we want. And I think that's the future that all of us want. It's a future that we would all be delighted to live in. But it's really not too good to be true. That is the future that many people around the world already have. We can have that future. It doesn't have to be something that would be beyond reach. That isn't too much to ask. That is how good countries are supposed to be run. But if we want that future, we're going to have to vote for it. And that's the reality. We're going to have to find a way of standing together and voting for it. And at the Referendum Party, we've given that future a name. And we've said that we want to live in a first world country at Africa's southern tip. And that's our dream, to create a first world country at Africa's southern tip. And we're saying that in 2024, you're going to be voting for one of two things. You're either going to be voting for a first world country, or whether you like it or not, you're going to be voting for an African failed state, because that's the other future that we're going to end up if we're not careful with. And that then leads us on to some other questions. Is there anybody here who thinks if everybody in the Western Cape votes for the ANC, that we're going to end up with that future of our dreams? You laugh because it's so obviously not going to happen. The ANC, if they didn't cause all of our problems, they've certainly exasperated them all for the ones that they inherited. The slightly more complicated question, and this is a question that we want to pose to the people of the Western Cape, because I think a lot of people haven't thought this through. Is there anybody here who thinks if everybody in the Western Cape votes for the DA, we're going to get that future of our dreams? And I think that's a really important point, and I'm glad we've got there, because the reality is the DA have already governed the Western Cape for 14 years. We don't have to worry about what it might look in 10 years. They've had 14 years already. Are we living in the future of our dreams? No, we're not. And I have to say at this point, I'm not here to knock the DA. The DA, I think we all recognise, have done a much better job of running the Western Cape than the ANC had of the rest of South Africa. The problem is not the DA. And if we elected the Freedom Front Plus, or if we elected the Referendum Party, if we elected any other party, if we don't change the system of government, no political party can deliver the future of our dreams, because it's not the party that's the problem, it's the system of government that we're stuck in. And let's look at the DA's record, because they are the people that have governed us. Do we live in a non-racial country? No, we don't. The DA don't agree with race-based policy, but they implement it anyway because national governments say they must. Do we live in a country that's safe and crime-free? Well, the Western Cape has the highest murder rate in the world. And the Western Cape government has been fighting for 5 years to get control of policing, but it can't. We have 1 in 4 people in the Western Cape are unemployed, and our unemployment rate, whilst better than the rest of South Africa, is 3 times higher than our international peers. We do have people begging on the streets. We do have people living in poverty. Our railways don't work. We have power cuts every single day of our lives. We don't have electricity. The squatter camps are mushrooming at an alarming rate. They're not getting smaller, they're getting bigger. And our money is now worth 5 times less than what it was in 1994. So in the current system of government, voting for the DA or any other party is not going to solve our problems. And we've got another slogan at the Referendum Party that explains that, and it says this: a DA government in Cape Town is not going to save us if an ANC government in Pretoria is making all of the decisions. And that, of course, is the problem. If we're going to claim the future that we want, then we have to start making decisions for ourselves. We need to have the ability to decide for ourselves what it is that we want. We need to be able to elect our own government, when we need to remove that government if it doesn't perform. And of course, this is the essence of the fight for Cape independence. The fight for Cape independence is to fight for us to be able to make decisions for ourselves, as opposed to being at the mercy of the decisions that are made by voters in the rest of the country who, for whatever reason, think differently to how we think, because we can see how they voted for the last 30 years. And if voting for the ANC isn't going to deliver the future of our dreams, and voting for the DA isn't going to deliver the future of our dreams, then what is? Who is? And the answer is you. You've got to deliver the future of the dreams. It isn't going to be us. It isn't going to be any political party. It has to be the people of the Western Cape deciding that they've had enough, that we're not going to carry on with this system of government. We can change that future for ourselves, but only if we're willing to stand up and to do it. And interesting, I'll come back to this later. I don't know many, perhaps some of you follow Pierre de Vos, the law professor, who obviously absolutely despises Cape independence and has far too much to say on the subject, most of it quite uninformed. But he said on the radio recently, the only way you'll get Cape independence is with the revolution. Well, he's right. The only way we're going to get Cape independence is with a revolution. What's the revolution? The people of the Western Cape voting to leave South Africa. That's a revolution. It's a peaceful revolution. It's a democratic revolution, but it's a revolution. It's us revolting against the government, revolting against the system. We don't have to have a bloody and violent revolution. We've got the right to have a referendum in our constitution. So we need a revolution. And where does the revolution start? It doesn't start with a political party. It starts with the people. We have to start that revolution. And that, of course, brings me on to my second point, defiance. The system of government does not work for the people of the Western Cape. For 30 years, we've been governed by the party that we rejected. We didn't vote the ANC in, and we cannot mathematically vote the ANC out. We are passengers on a ship where the direction is determined by voters in the rest of the country, and what we want has become irrelevant. And it's a statistical fact that the majority of Western Cape voters have never once voted for the ANC in 30 years, but they've never been governed at a national level by anybody else anyway. So why on earth would we agree to remain in that system where we literally never ever get what we want, and the consequences is that we're denied the future of our dreams? Why would we stay in that system? But that begs another question. Why the hell have we stayed in it for 30 years? Why are we still in the system? And the answer to that is that the two biggest parties in South Africa, the DA and the ANC, are absolutely brilliant at one thing. And that's manipulating voters to do what they want them to do. Now, the ANC, they keep us in check by calling us racist every time we open our mouths to complain. And over a period of time, we've been bullied into silence. And we now live in a situation where we have the emperor's new clothes. We all know what's wrong. We all know what needs to be done to fix it, but we're just too scared to stand up and say it. We have been made ashamed of our heritage. We've been told to sit in the corner, be quiet, and to take our medicine. Well, I'm telling you now, and I'm telling you as somebody who's come into this country and perhaps looks at it from a different way, we've got to get out of that corner. We've got to stand up and speak. If they want to call us racist, if they want to call us names, let them. We must not be silent. Let them call us names. Let them do what they want, but we have to stand up, take responsibility for our own future. They are the arseholes, if you excuse my language, not us. And we need to actually stand up and realise that we're fighting for something that's really important, and it doesn't really matter what they are going to call us. Their words only have the power that we give them. So that's the ANC. When it comes to the DA, how do the DA do it? Well, the DA keep us in check by saying, well, if you don't vote for us, the ANC are going to come back. And that's how they bully us into doing what they want. And I'm going to tell you a short story of something that happened to me on election day, last election, and perhaps it happened to some of you. So at about 12 o'clock, I got an SMS from the DA saying, your ward is neck and neck with the ANC. If you don't want to have an ANC government, go out and vote for the DA. Every vote counts. When the results were counted in my ward, the DA had 98% of the vote. It had just been a flat-out lie. But that's how the DA do it. They insist that the ANC is going to come back. And the reality is that in the Western Cape, the ANC is dead. They got 20% of the vote in the last election. They couldn't possibly put together a government under any circumstances. But beyond all of that, and because we know that the DA is so good at telling that story and people get wrapped up in it every single time, we decided as a party that we're going to make an election promise at the Referendum Party. And that is, we promise in our manifesto that there are no circumstances at all in which we will vote with the ANC to allow them to form a government. So you know that a vote for the Referendum Party will never put the ANC back into power. And more than that, we've said we'll vote with the DA and we'll help them to form a Western Cape government. After they've got the government, you know, all's fair in love and war, but we'll make sure that they remain the government so that everybody who votes for us knows that under no circumstances are they allowing the ANC back into power in the Western Cape, or nationally, by the way, because we'll join in the multi-party charter and do exactly the same thing, so that nobody has to fear that the ANC will be coming back to the Western Cape, and that then stops you being bullied into voting for the DA, because the DA are very good at managing our present. They're very good at fixing these little things around now, but ultimately they're not going to deliver the future that we want on Cape independence. But collectively, they also know that if they call a referendum, the people of the Western Cape are going to vote to leave. And they've polled it, we've polled it, I'm pretty sure the ANC have polled it, but I don't know if that's a fact, but I know the DA know. So collectively, the DA and the ANC are withholding that referendum. Not much we can do at this point in time, which is exactly why we've got the referendum. We had a promise, and we'll come to that now, I guess. But I personally negotiated the referendum. Neil was in the room too, with John Steenhuisen, who promised that he would call a referendum on Cape independence. 2021, and actually the DA have reneged on that promise, and we're going to have to now sort that, which is why the Referendum Party exists. But perhaps we'll come back to that. So we've got to get beyond that. We've got to get in a situation where we stop being controlled by political parties who want to impose their agenda onto us. And as the people of the Western Cape, we need to start imposing our agenda onto them. And we have to decide what future is it that we want. If we want this future, and I think we all do, and why would we not want that future? Then we need to decide what needs to be done to deliver it, and we need to make our politicians listen to us. Many of you will have signed up with the organisation Cape Exit. If you haven't, you'll certainly be aware of it. Cape Exit have got 840,000 mandates. We don't need 840,000 people to deliver Cape independence. I'm going to come back to this number time and time again. We need 100,000 people to vote for the Referendum Party. With 100,000 votes, we can deliver a referendum on Cape independence, and through that, Cape independence itself. So what we need is, of that 840,000 people who've signed up to say, I want Cape independence, we need 100,000 of them to lift their fingers and say, all right, I'm actually going to go and vote for the future that I want. And if people do that, if 100,000 voters vote for Cape independence, then we will achieve it. And that brings me on to my third point, which is belief. How many times have you been told that Cape independence just isn't possible? Yeah. And remember what I said at the start. Apathy and defeatism are the biggest enemies. And if you think of all of those people who are arguing for you against Cape independence, how many times has somebody said, you know what, it just isn't a very good idea? Nobody says that. Who's come along and said, listen, you don't need Cape independence, we're actually better off under an ANC national government? Nobody would possibly argue that. Or when did anyone say, well, don't worry, in 10 years' time, all of our problems are going to be solved, you haven't got to worry about Cape? Nobody says that at all, because if you said any of those things, you would laugh them out of the room. So people don't try to argue that Cape independence isn't a good idea. They try to convince you to give up without trying by saying it's impossible, you're wasting your time. And actually, that's how they try to stop you fighting for Cape independence. And they do it well. So I want to be absolutely clear. Cape independence is 100% unequivocally, without doubt, possible. And I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it. I'm going to give you some facts that I hope will convince you of the truth without a shadow of doubt. And if you want the source for these facts, let me know and we'll put them on the website, send them to you by email or whatever. Number one, in the last 50 years, 35 countries have got their independence around the world. On average, one every 17 months. And if you look at the map of the world 100 years ago, you wouldn't recognise it. If you look at it 120 years ago, South Africa wasn't on it. So the world is constantly changing. And countries form and break up the whole time. There's nothing spectacular about Cape Independence. It's just part of the normal evolution of countries. Number two, self-determination, which is obviously the legal right that's the heart of Cape Independence, is a human right that South Africa by law is obliged to uphold. It has no right, right to refuse the right of self-determination. And since 1994, South Africa has signed 3 separate international charters, all of which bind South Africa voluntarily to the right of self-determination. And it's in the South African Constitution. So independence happens all the time. We have a right to self-determination. The Western Cape, fact number 3, is in a really privileged position. Most countries who want independence have to fight their national government to obtain a referendum. And it's a fight, and we can see it in Scotland. Scotland is trying to get its second referendum. It's gone to court. It's fighting because the UK said, you've had one referendum. We don't want to give you a second referendum. And Scotland cannot hold a referendum without the UK's permission. We are so lucky in South Africa that our constitution grants provincial premiers the right to call referendums. We don't need the ANC's permission. We don't need South African government's position. All we need is the premier who we elect to call a referendum. Now, our premier is a problem. Our premier is a problem, and our premier says, I'm South African first. I don't support Cape Independence. I'm South African first. Our view is this, that our premier should resign, and he should go and stand in the South African Parliament. Because the South African Parliament is the constitutional body that is supposed to represent all of the people of South Africa. There's nothing wrong with Alan Winde saying, I'm South African first, but then go and stand in the Parliament for South African people. Don't get yourself appointed as the Premier of the Western Cape, whose sole job is to look after the people of the Western Cape. And when it comes to listening to the people of the Western Cape, say, well, I'm not going to listen to you because I'm South African first. It's bonkers. So we've got to bring Alan Winde to heel. But the Western Cape, from that legal point of view, has the right to call its own referendum. That is goldmine. Number 4, and I think I've referred to it in the polling, so I'm not going to dwell on this. We know that the Western Cape will win a referendum if we call one. We haven't got to worry about the outcome. We've polled it again. All parties agree. I've even got internal documents from the DA where they say we can't have a referendum, in their words, because we're walking into a Brexit scenario. They know they're going to lose. That's why they don't want to hold the referendum. If they thought they'd win the referendum, they would probably hold it in a flash. Point number 5, and this is a contentious one, so it's really important that we know this. The Western Cape government, I should say, and the South African government will have to honour the outcome of the referendum. And I'm sure you've heard people say referendums aren't binding. And of course, that's absolutely true in the literal sense. If you read the Constitution, it doesn't say whether they're binding or they're not binding. What does the Constitution say? That the Western Cape Premier, all premiers, have the right to hold provincial referendums. It doesn't say what comes next, because actually the constitutional right is to ask the question, what is a referendum? A referendum is a means by asking the people in a democracy what it is that they want. That's its entire purpose. And how do I then know that the Western Cape government and the South African government will have to abide by the outcome? Because that exact question has been tested in 2 of the most senior courts in the world, and they've already established that. One is the Supreme Court of Canada in the case of the Quebec referendum, where there was the debate over exactly this question. And the Supreme Court of Canada invited all of the world's experts on many of the world's leading experts on international law as friends of the court, and they asked exactly this question. What did the Supreme Court of Canada say? You cannot ignore the democratic will of the people in a democracy. In the second case, ironically, of Scotland, and the second court that's confirmed that is the UK Supreme Court last year in the case of Scotland. What did Scotland ask for? If you go and read the judgment, they couldn't get a referendum that was binding because the first referendum, the UK government has said we will abide by the outcome. They agreed to be bound by the outcome. So Scotland said we want to hold a referendum, but we want a non-binding referendum. The UK Supreme Court says in a democracy there's no such thing as a non-binding referendum. You can't ask the people what it is they want in a democracy and then ignore the outcome. So we know it's binding. The last one, point 6, the international community will support us. How do we know that? Because we've spent the last 2 or 3 years talking to the international community. I have spoken to political leaders in the US, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, in Italy, in Estonia, in Germany, in Austria, and I've not yet found one who isn't willing to support us. Now, no country is going to support us in advance. It would be illegal. But in those conversations, when I first started, I remember the first meeting I had, which was a delegation for the European Parliament. And I had this long speech, and I thought, well, these people won't understand South Africa, and it's going to be far too complicated for them. They're going to think we're raving racists. And I started had this long presentation where I very gently led them down the road to let them know how bad things were. And I almost stopped me halfway through the conversation. And I think it was the Austrian guy, I can't remember which one, said, look, we spent the first 2 weeks of our trip in Pretoria in the north, and we spent the next 2 weeks in the Western Cape. We get it. We get it. And actually, I'm in touch with many of those people to this day. No question. So, can we be sure of delivering Cape independence? We can. And what were those 6 points to remind you? It's happening all the time. One country every 17 months. One every 17 months. Self-determination is a right that South Africa has sworn to uphold. We don't need to fight for a referendum in the national government. We've got a right to hold a referendum. We know we're going to win one if it's held. We know that once it's held, the outcome is going to be binding effectively, even though it's not in the text of the Constitution. And once we've held the referendum, we know that the international community is going to support us. All we have to do, because Cape independence is the key to that future that we want. We all know what we want. We all agree. And it was the same at last night's meeting, the same at next meeting. We've run focus groups. Everybody wants the same thing. All we have to do is we have to force the Western Cape Premier to call a referendum. Now, we've done it once. I personally negotiated a referendum on Cape independence with John Steenhuisen. Now, the DA, unfortunately, have broken their word. We agreed that before the 2021 elections. After the elections, they've now gone back on their word. They messed around for a long time, but they've now gone back on their word. But I think we all know that story from the Bible of Moses and the Pharaohs. The Pharaohs said they were going to let the Israelites go. After the plague was finished, the Pharaohs changed their mind, and Moses had to go back and bring the second plague. Well, the Referendum Party is the second plague. We've had it once, they've broken the promise. Now we need to hit them where it hurts, and that's with votes in the election to go back and say, we want a referendum on Cape independence. And bear in mind that polling shows 68% of people in the Western Cape want a referendum on Cape independence. And it's not just our poll that's found that. The DA have got our poll, because we've given them the data, but they also have the other polls that were done, so they know that's the case. So that's really not a great situation where they know that 68% of people want a referendum, and actually they promised a referendum, yet they're still not going to do it. And Harvard University did some research and they ended up developing something called the 3.5% rule. You may have seen this for those that are on the Cape Exit platforms. And they researched movements around the world where people were wanting to change. They wanted to change the countries they lived in. And they looked at every country in the world from 1906 to forward, and they discovered two things. Non-violent protest was twice as likely to succeed as violent protest, and where 3.5% of the population got involved in a protest movement, it never fails. Never once, since 1906, anywhere in the world, have 3.5% of the population got involved and failed. 3.5% of the Western Cape voting population is 100,000 100,000 people. That's the number, 100,000. It's the number we must get in our heads. Ironically, I didn't work it out from the 3.5% rule. We worked that out as the number of votes that would get the DA to 48%, because at 48%, they're left with no other coalition partners other than hopefully us or the Freedom Front Plus. It doesn't really matter which one they go with. Either which way, they will have to call a referendum on Cape independence. The ACDP will not force them to call a referendum. They've got 1.5%, so we need to get them below 50% and below the number that the ACDP would be able to bail them out. And that works out at 100,000. So it's obviously meant to be the 3.5% rule, the 100,000. That's the number, 100,000 voters. And if we get 100,000 people to vote for Cape independence, and it's not a big number, if 840,000 have signed up with Cape Exit, then we can deliver the referendum. If we deliver the referendum, Cape independence is certain thereafter. And that then brings me to my final point, responsibility. Responsibility. We know what we want. We've agreed it at the start, the hope. We know the current system doesn't work for us. We need to defy it. We need defiance. I hope I've convinced you that Cape independence really is possible, the belief. The question is, what are you willing to do to deliver it? My story with Cape independence started in the Engia Church in Wellington. And I used to go there, and there was my favourite preacher was a guy called Benny van Rensburg. And Benny was an interesting character because he liked religion and politics. People say never mix them. It was my two favourite subjects. And I used to love going to church on a Sunday and listening to Benny because his preaching was so practical. And I followed the Cape independence story for a while. I knew I wanted it to happen, but here's me, this British guy who's been here for 20 years. It's not my place. How must I get involved? I just hoped it would sort itself out. And Benny stood up one Sunday and he said, you know, there's no point in coming to church on a Sunday and praying that God is going to save our country if you're going to go home on Monday and do nothing about it yourself. And actually, it was the truth. We all know it's the truth. And I went home and I spoke to my wife and I said, you know, I'm interested in Cape independence. That really kind of hit me where it hurts. That's the truth. And yes, it's going to be crazy if me, as that some British guy stands up and does this, but we've got to, and I'm feeling that I must do that. My wife was very supportive. She might regret it now, but said, go and do it. And the next week I started with Cape independence. 8 weeks later, the CIAG was formed, and 4 years later, here I stand, having been involved at the heart of Western Cape politics from that moment. And that was that choice. What was I going to do? Was I going to go home on Monday and stand up and do something about it? Or actually, was I just going to go back to my life? And I stood up. And I guess one of the challenges for the Referendum Party is, what are you going to do? What are we going to do? Are you going to stand up? Are you going to go out tomorrow and say, right, you know what? Yes, we can have a different future. Yes, we can change the system, and I'm going to do something about it. Or actually, are we just going to surrender and go back to our old lives and accept what's coming to us? And that is the key decision that I think we all have to make, because we all know if we don't do something now, where we're going to end up. People say, okay, I'm in, but what can I do? What can I do? Well, I'm going to tell you 5 things that every single person can do. Number 1, you can vote for Cape independence in 2024 in all 3 ballots. For the first time ever, there's going to be 3 ballots, a provincial ballot, a regional ballot, national ballot. We're going to be on all 3 ballots. But I'm going to say something that's probably odd for a political party. I hope you're going to vote for the Referendum Party. If you vote for the Freedom Front Plus, if you vote for the Cape Independence Party, we actually don't care. We don't want power. We don't want to run the Western Cape. We want a referendum on Cape independence, and as long as you vote for Cape independence and against the DA who are denying us Cape independence, then we'll get it. That's what we need to do. Number 1, go and vote for Cape independence. Don't worry about voting against the DA. You're going to get a DA government in the Western Cape anyway. We're going to vote with the DA to allow them to form a government. The Freedom Front Plus is going to vote with the DA to get a government. There's no notion that the ANC are coming back. At a national level, we're going to join the multi-party charter. It's a dead loss. It's absolutely no chance of success. but we're not going to be the reason that it fails, so we'll join it. The Freedom Front Plus are already in it, so you haven't got to worry about anything. You're going to be playing your part to get the ANC out of power nationally. You'll end up with a DA government provincially anyway, but vote against the DA and for a party that supports the Cape Independence in all 3 ballots. Number 2, join us. Join us at the Referendum Party. At the back, there's some application forms. Before you leave today, fill in the form. Come join us. Take hands with us. Become part of this Cape Independence army that's going to deliver the future of our dreams. Number 3, once you've joined us, don't stop at that. Get involved in a branch. If there isn't a branch, set one up, because we need to build this team of people across the Western Cape who are going to come together and make sure that at election time we get our 100,000 votes. Number 4, volunteer. Everybody has a skill. Maybe you're great at talking to people and you can just convince your friends in coffee shops or neighbours or the church committee or whatever it is about Cape Independence. Maybe you love social media and you can put on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whatever you're on, but you can spread the word about Cape Independence. Maybe you're a graphic designer or an artist or a musician and you can do something that raises awareness. Maybe you've got connections everywhere and you can say to our team, hey, that was great, that talk. My cousin stays in St. Helena Bay. Can you do a talk there? My work colleague would love to do this and they stay in Neisner. Help us to set up the next meeting and the next meeting and the next meeting. Perhaps you've got connections to people who've got money. Perhaps you've got money yourself. Talk to Neil, who's our tireless fundraiser, and it's the worst job in the world. And I have utter admiration. If anybody thinks my job's hard, then they have no idea what his job is like. Perhaps you write. Perhaps you can write to the local newspaper. Perhaps you can write to the national newspapers. Perhaps you can write to News 24. You can do something. Everybody you haven't got to put 50 hours in a week. Just if you've got some time, everybody does a bit, then collectively we will absolutely make a huge difference. And then the last one, and I've kind of touched on this anyway, tell your friends, your family, your colleagues. We have to spread this word. And when we developed our messaging, I should say this, and it's an interesting point, we ran focus groups. And what we did is we put people in a room, our target market. We know exactly who our target market is. They didn't know why they were there. They were there because they fell in the demographics, which is people who are actually the vast majority of strongest Cape Independence supporters are over the age of 35, white or coloured, living in residential areas or town centres. And so we took a focus group of people who'd voted DA in 2019. They notionally supported Cape Independence in terms of when there was a box, would you support Cape Independence, yes or no? And they belonged to this particular demographic group. But they did, and then we started asking them questions. And you'll recognise some of our messaging because of that. First of all, we asked them, would you consider voting against the DA? No. Everybody was absolutely certain they were going to vote for the DA. Then we asked them, well, what kind of future would you like for yourself? People then worked out the future they want. Then we asked them, well, is the DA going to give you that future? And everybody started to realise, well, no, it's not. Then we said, well, what is going to give you that future? And here's the fascinating point and why being an ambassador is so important. In every single group, somebody, and bearing in mind that technically everybody in the group supports Cape Independence, the first person would introduce the idea of Cape Independence, but really shyly. Well, we could, and they often want to use the word Cape Independence, maybe we could form a republic, and they'd find this way. And what happened with the groups was fascinating. The second person determined the outcome of the group. The first person raised the idea of Cape Independence. In a group where the second person said, well, I think that's a good idea, the whole group went to Cape Independence. The second person came out and said, well, I don't think that's possible. They dropped the subject there and then it went on, and that was the end of it. And that's how important it is to have ambassadors to go out and spread that word, because that second person, that's that person who decides. You know, when somebody says, well, what about Cape Independence? It's the next person that comes in that says, that's a great idea. And you allow other people to join that movement. You allow other people to believe. And if we don't do that, then it just dies and that's the end of the message. So what are the 5 things we can do? Vote for Cape Independence, join the Referendum Party, get involved in a branch, volunteer and do what you can do, and tell people about Cape Independence. And if we can do that, that future will not be a dream. It will be our reality. And imagine a future where our friends who've gone overseas come back, where our children, our grandchildren want to be in this country rather than not being able to wait to leave once they've got their qualifications because they see no future here. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.